Let me start by saying several years ago, as a fresh philosophy major, I signed up for a logic course, hoping to become more like Spock, from Star Trek. I had no idea, though, I would end up instead like Paula. Paula was my instructor, and she made logic come to life, and she has really been a part of my career as a mentor, but then also as a friend, and we've worked on several projects. And she's the one who introduced me to the CPP as I was an undergraduate student. And so I've got me started, hooked on the CPP. So she's dedicated, she's insightful, she's patient and inspiring.
Oh, wow.
And right, she used to give her phone number out to undergraduate students if they needed help.
I don't do that anymore.
She's really focused on the flourishing of her students. I mean, the amount of time she's talked about, how to best reach and to help students are just uncountable. She's also dedicated to the community. And she's an impeccable researcher and author. There's a reason I asked for her help when I had the opportunity to edit a book, my first book, Doctor Who in Philosophy. So I said, I've got to have Paula. That's the only way it works. And so recently, I even referred to her as a saint because of her constant willingness to serve as a poll worker in South Mississippi, in order to ensure our elections remain in the power of the people. So that's why I referred to you as a saint. I have another poll worker friend in Atlanta. Paula's been a member of the Concerned Philosophers for Peace since 1987 at the first National CPP Conference. And she was active from 87 to 95. She then did a little hiatus, sort of like our favorite television show, Doctor Who, did in the 80s. But she has come back strong since 2017 and is the current president. She received her PhD from Tulane University and is the associate professor and program coordinator for philosophy and religion at the University of Southern Mississippi. Some of her works include a co-edited volume, Community, Diversity, and Difference, Implications for Peace, which is the Philosophy of Peace series for Brill and Rodopi, their Value Inquiry book. More recently, she's got a chapter, Stoking Anger and Weaponizing Untruth, How Mind Viruses Undermine Social Justice. That is in a collection that I co-edited called The Ethics of Anger from Lexington Books. She also has a chapter, The Lies of the Land, Post-Truth, The Erosion of Democracy, and the Challenge for Positive Peace, in the forthcoming Brill and Rodopi volume edited by Sanjay Lal called Peaceful Approaches for a More Peaceful World. And I mean, this is why I keep telling her she needs to put all this into a best-selling book. She has a chapter called How Mind Viruses and Rhinoceroses Promote Tyranny in the book Civility, Nonviolent Resistance, and the New Struggle for Social Justice. Also from Brill and Rodopi, edited by Amin Safari, which is out now. And I can't go without mentioning our two co-edited volumes, Doctor Who in Philosophy and More Doctor Who in Philosophy, which is subliminally on her bookshelf. Thank you for joining us this evening. I know you'll enjoy Reconstruction 2021, Restoring Health, Truth, and Democracy, for it promises to provide hope that the distinction between truth and lies will again reemerge, hopefully. Please help me welcome the president of the CPP, Dr. Paula Smithka.
Thanks, everyone. Court, thanks very much for the kind introduction. And I first of all want to say that it is just an absolute honor to have been elected president of Concerned Philosophers for Peace. So thank you all for voting me in. I appreciate that very much. I also want to extend a very hearty thank you to the conference organizers who pulled off this wonderful virtual conference. Andrew Fiala, Greg Moses, and Court Lewis. Your dedication and technological expertise has been wonderful, and so thanks for all your efforts for doing that. One more thank you to the Executive Committee of Concerned Philosophers for Peace, who work hard to keep the organization up and running. But a very special shout out to Jennifer Kling, the Executive Director, who very energetically and tirelessly keeps the business and keeps the business of CPP going and keeps us all afloat. So thanks, Jen, and the rest of the executive committee for all your time and efforts. Much appreciated. And to the rest of you for showing up this evening. It's great to have you. I have enjoyed very much this conference. And for a virtual conference, it has really just been fantastic. Well, so let's begin. The theme of this conference is hope in dark times. And 2020 has been a dark year dealing with the coronavirus. The coronavirus as a pandemic has taken the toll on the health and life of people worldwide. But in the United States, our numbers have been higher than they ever really needed to be if we had an effective federal program to deal with the coronavirus. We've had 26 million cases, and as of today, 437,000 deaths. The pandemic has caused economic turmoil that has been extremely devastating to so many individuals and small businesses, and particularly those in the service industry. So 2020 has been indeed a year of suffering. But in addition to this, all the troubles and dealing with the coronavirus, we have been dealing with, for some time, another sometimes very deadly set of viruses. These are mind viruses. The mind viruses have been fueled by flagrant disregard for the nature of truth, with the, unfortunately, it seems like ever-present false equivalence between truth and lies. And we've observed the undermining of facts in the form of science denial and the presentation and defense of these so-called alternative facts. These mind viruses have spread widely as a result of fake news and social media, which have stoked anger, fostered and reinforced racism, and related to that reinforced racism and institutionalized racism, we've seen the brutal police killings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, among way too many others. And recently, we've witnessed a rise in anti-Asian sentiment as a result of in the wake of the COVID pandemic. These mind viruses undergird and fortify the political polarization, and under the Trump administration, these mind viruses have become even more virulent and widespread. Crucially, they've contributed to the erosion of the foundational principles of democracy. And while now there is hope for overcoming the coronavirus, we need to question, is there hope for overcoming these mind viruses? So we're going to talk about some mind viruses shortly. Admittedly, when I learned of this conference theme, peace and hope in dark times, and this was back in early 2020, And our conference was originally scheduled for late October. I was really concerned about what I might be able to say in this presidential address. I mean, at the time, I just wasn't really seeing a whole lot of peace. Violence was erupting in what should have remained peaceful and socially significant Black Lives Matter protests. There was the continued hateful rhetoric taking place between politicians running for office, the polarized political parties, and the demonization of one another across parties. Everyone who's not part of your group was considered evil and, a danger to our democracy. I saw the continued hate speech on social media and unfortunately, the political divides created essentially civil war almost, right? Within the context of families and with friends, where personal attacks took place as opposed to rational discussion about political policies and candidates' strategies and so on. Instead, what should have been ways of talking and communicating devolved into essentially fights, literal fights, and separation even among family and friends. So, mask wearing? Well, instances about violence associated with wearing masks. If you didn't want to wear a mask, you shouldn't have to. And when you were asked to, confrontations broke out. So where's the peace? And I wondered, well, what about hope? At that particular time, throughout the spring and the summer and early fall of 2020, the pandemic's raging. People are suffering. Businesses are shutting down, particularly restaurants. People are unemployed. And importantly, the outcome of the election at that time was uncertain. And the bit of hope I did see was that we had dedicated scientists and medical personnel who were working very hard to develop a vaccine against coronavirus. But honestly, I was really fretting and stewing about trying to find peace and hope in those dark times. So in a way, I'm actually glad our conference was postponed till January for those reasons. Now, one bright spot in 2020 that we could celebrate was the 100th year anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment. Yay. It was a bright spot in a lot of darkness. But today, we do have cause to be hopeful with the successful development of COVID-19 vaccinations. And the distribution is underway, albeit way too slowly and not efficiently enough that we will eventually, and hopefully eventually, we will return to something more normal. But right now, the rollout's very, very tedious and slow. That needs to do better. But because we have the vaccines, we do have the hope for the restoration of health beginning here in 2021. And now that it's post November 3rd, we have the election of a history-making Biden-Harris administration. And with that, I think there is renewed hope that the distinction between truth and lies may again reemerge And that will help to diminish this relentless attack on truth that has fostered the spread of these mind viruses. And those mind viruses have contributed to the undermining of democratic principles, which are the foundation of our nation, our American democracy. At least now, there is, I think, a path for Reconstruction wherein we can find hope for the restoration of health, truth, and democracy. Unfortunately, though, these mind viruses are much more difficult to treat than even that new coronavirus, which has caused all this illness and death. It's so much more difficult to treat. Why? I mean, we can't send our scientists into a lab and develop a vaccine to be administered as a shot in the arm or perhaps in the head of our citizenry to help them think a little more clearly. But first, what do I mean by mind viruses? Let's unpack this notion just a little bit. Richard Dawkins, in his work, The Selfish Gene, introduced the notion of memes as cultural information-bearing units. As the analog to genes, which are bearers of genetic information transmitted via replication within populations of organisms, memes are likewise information-bearing units, which are transmitted from one brain to another. So Dawkins characterizes memes as tunes, ideas, catchphrases, clothes fashions, and a whole host of other things. But Dawkins says the following: just as genes propagate themselves in the gene pool by leaping from body to body via sperm or eggs, so memes propagate themselves in the meme pool by leaping from brain to brain via a process which, in the broad sense, can be called imitation, end quote. So memes move from brain to brain through the means of communication, in discourse, in letters, in emails, books, radio, television, and in particular, social media. And what's interesting about memes is that when they are indeed transmitted, those who receive memes have their neurological patterns altered. This has been shown by studies in neuroscience. Consider the following passage from the neuropsychologist N.K. Humphrey. He says this: memes should be regarded as living structures, not just metaphorically, but technically. When you plant a fertile meme in my mind, you literally parasitize my brain, turning it into a vehicle for the meme's propagation in just the way that a virus may parasitize the genetic mechanism of a host cell. And this isn't just a way of talking. The meme for, say, belief in life after death is actually realized physically millions of times over as a structure in the nervous systems of individual people the world over, end quote. So the idea is when we experience these memes, we literally have our neurological pathways altered. So even though they're not encoded in our DNA, these are genuine biological alterations in brains. So we're not dealing simply here with metaphors. Just as genes are successful in transmitting their genetic information when they replicate, so also the success of memes depends upon the spread of their information content. And like genes that produce phenotypic effects in organisms, Memes manifest themselves phenotypically in the behavior which can be imitated by others. So, building on Richard Dawkins' concept of memes as cultural information units, Jeffrey Gold and Neil Shanks, in their chapter called Mind Viruses and the Importance of Cultural Diversity, contend that mind viruses are parasitic conformity memeplexes. By memeplex, we mean complexes of memes taken together. I'll say a bit more about that in just a second. But these conformity memeplexes shut down the host's ability to rationally consider other points of view, including additional counter evidence to one's position. We don't like to be disagreed with. We like to have our confirmation bias reaffirmed. So mind viruses tend to foster dogmatism and intolerance, and these can be transferred to other hosts, and they can be detrimental. How can they be detrimental? These conformity memes like genes work within complexes and not so much alone. So if you look at gene complexes, those are the groups of genes that work together that produce things like teeth and wings and claws and digestive systems and things like that in organisms. Well, some examples of these meme complexes or memeplexes are religious and political ideologies. However, there are culturally harmful conformity meme complexes, and we've been experiencing a lot of these of late. So some harmful conformity memeplex examples would be racism, sexism, homophobia, and ideologies like these. But what they all have in common is generating a homogeneous way of thinking. And that homogeneous way of thinking undermines cultural heterogeneity, stifling diversity and fostering intolerance to difference. You've got to think alike. And as we'll see, if you don't think alike, you're an enemy and you're evil. Now, we should say and make this very clear, not all memes are deleterious. In fact, we might want to argue that the memes that produce individual liberty, free speech, and tolerance are just the sorts of memes that democratic society should espouse and propagate. Why? Because they provide a foundation for a peaceful and civil society. Nevertheless, the conformity memeplexes that I cited above, racism and sexism and homophobia, among others, have the potential to turn into mind viruses. And mind viruses are detrimental to their hosts because, according to Gold and Shanks, they, quote, arrest aspects of cognitive development, leading to a kind of cognitive paralysis where the host assumes infallibility and fails to utilize their own powers of judgment and discrimination. So these dogmatism-inducing viruses curtail free thinking, free speech, and tolerance, and generate homogenized ways of thinking. And when that happens, civility and peaceful coexistence between people who hold differing views is threatened, because the people who hold different views are no longer worthy opponents. I mean, consider our political situation, what we're seeing here in the polarized, hyperpolarization in politics. The other side aren't worthy opponents. They're enemies. They're evil. And on a larger scale, this homogenized thinking tends to produce factions or tribes. And in these factions or tribes or political parties, the allegiance is more important than the facts or truth. And divergent views are censored or even silenced by sometimes violent means. So that's a bit on mind viruses, but how do they spread? Well, the key or a key to successful meme transmission is the repetition of catchy phrases replayed in the media over and over again. You might think of Donald Trump's campaign slogan, "Build the wall," or his ad hominem mantra against Hillary Clinton, "Crooked Hillary," or the repetition of all those lies. So what happens is, in the repetition, who's responsible? The media, social platforms, social media platforms in particular. And interestingly, even when media outlets are respectable and reliable sources, they still repeat the very same lies and mantras, etc., that keep spreading out to people. And again, the more brains that hear these various repetitive lies, their neurological pathways get altered. And the more they hear them, those pathways become habituated. So, endless repetition not only creates new pathways in the brains of people who hear them, it reinforces the pathways of previous hearers, creating those habitual pathways. David Eagleman's a neuroscientist, and he talks about what he calls the illusion of truth effect. And essentially what this means is that people tend to believe things that they've heard before, whether those claims are true or not. Let me give you a quote from Eagleman. He says the following, quote, "You're more likely to believe that a statement is true if you've heard it before, whether or not it's actually true. Experimenters have found a clear result. If subjects had heard a sentence in previous weeks, they were more likely now to rate it as true, even if they swore they'd never heard it before. And this is the case even when the experimenter tells the subjects that the sentences they are about to hear are false. Despite this, mere exposure to an idea is enough to boost its believability upon later contact. The illusion of truth effect highlights the potential danger of people who are repeatedly exposed to the same religious edicts or political slogans," end quote. Consider the repetition of lies and memes that we've seen over the past 4 years. I mean, consider, for just example, Trump's repeated claims about the effectiveness of hydroxychloroquine as a preventative for treatment of COVID-19. Even when the doctors came out and discounted, the effects of this and suggested it ought not to be used because it causes a higher risk of serious heart arrhythmias, because an Arizona couple kept hearing about hydroxychloroquine, they focused only on the chloroquine part of hydroxychloroquine and ingested chloroquine phosphate, and the husband died. The wife ended up in critical condition. Trump's misinformation caused the death of one person here. And it is the attack on truth that facilitates, because the more and more those lies are put out there in the media and are spread on social media, increasingly it makes it easier for these mind viruses to spread. So what's the attack on truth? We know this very well, having lived through the Trump administration. But just to point out, according to the Washington Post fact checker blog, in their final count, Trump made 30,573 false or misleading claims during his tenure in office. We all grant politicians lie and mislead, but Trump's lying was unprecedented. But the words of a president matter, and he knows that. But what Trump did was to weaponize the untruth. Charles M. Blow characterizes Trump's strategy in the following way. Blow's a writer for New York Times. He says the following: tell a lie bigger than people can think a lie can be, thereby forcing their brains to seek the truth in it or vest some faith in it, even after no truth can be found. Tell the big lie. Hitler understood this. Trump understood it as well. Because of that, he was able to weaponize untruth. And the repeated lies created, well, mind viruses that were spread. I mean, just consider the conspiracy theories of QAnon and others. The big lie, of course, was that the election of November 3rd was rigged. There was rampant voter fraud, and Trump won the election by a landslide, and it was stolen from him. In this case, we're in an era of post-truth, where Lee McIntyre characterizes an era of post-truth is a time when truth gets eclipsed. Truth is irrelevant. And we've seen the outcome of truth being irrelevant. The lies being spread in social media. Mind viruses are dangerous. Why? Because they can facilitate not only linguistic, but physical violence. So, what are some examples of the mind viruses that we've experienced in the last several years? Do you remember Pizzagate, where Edgar Welch fired a weapon in the Comet Ping Pong Pizza restaurant in Washington, D.C. back on December 4th, 2016? Why did he do it? It was in response to internet rumors about Democrats harboring child sex slaves in the restaurant. He saw this over and over again in social media sites, and he believed it to be true. Why? In part, the illusion of truth effect. But whereas Edgar Welch was on the side of the Republicans against the Democrats, it happens on both sides of the political spectrum. Remember James Hodgkinson, who shot Steve Scalise on June 14th, 2017, while Scalise and others were practicing for a congressional baseball game for the annual charity event. Hodgkinson was a Bernie Sanders supporter and hated Trump and thought the Republicans needed to be carried, violence needed to be carried out against Republicans. Mind viruses are dangerous. More recently, we've seen an increase anger, discrimination, and hate speech and assaults against Asians. A lot of racism against Asians have occurred and xenophobia as a result of the mind viruses emerging out of what they read on social media, the racists, what they read on social media. And Asians have been attacked and assaulted and verbally abused in public places. There are many examples here, but I'll just give you one, essentially. An Asian woman who was wearing a face mask in the New York subway was assaulted by a man on February 2nd, 2020. He called her a diseased bitch and hit her on the head. And the cases of linguistic and physical violence against Asians aren't just restricted to the US. They're happening across the globe, as reported by Human Rights Watch. They report that assaults, verbal harassment, bullying, and discrimination against people of Asian descent have occurred in Italy, in the UK, in Australia. Notably, in Spain, a Chinese American man was so badly beaten he was in a coma for 2 days. These instances of linguistic and physical violence are the behavioral manifestations of the racist mind viruses that have stoked anger, in part perhaps because of fear of COVID, but largely because of the misinformation that is spread on social media sites which are not reputable. They are in part, largely actually, to blame for the spread of mind viruses and the increased virulence in those mind viruses. Even UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres characterized the recent anti-Asian discrimination during the coronavirus pandemic and the verbal and physical attacks on Asians. He called it a virus of hate, and basically pleaded that governments need to, quote, act now to strengthen the immunity of our societies against the virus of hate. Well, I've shown, I hope, that mind viruses are dangerous because they contribute to linguistic and physical violence. But my claim here too is that they've undermined democracy. How has that taken place? Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt, in their book, How Democracies Die, outline what they call a litmus test for autocrats. And they give 4 indicators. 1, rejection of or weak commitment to the democratic rules of the game. 2, denial of the legitimacy of their political opponents. 3, toleration or encouragement of violence. And 4, readiness to curtail civil liberties or opponents, including the media. I don't have time to get into all 4 of those. But if we look in particular at the previous Trump regime, which of course Trump has met all 4 of these criteria, Levitsky and Ziblatt have shown that. But if we look at the first indicator of undermining or having a weak commitment or a rejection of the democratic rules of the game, Levitsky and Ziblatt asked the following question associated with that. Do they attempt to undermine the legitimacy of elections? For example, by refusing to accept credible electoral results? Yeah, Trump did this. Way back in 2016, he was laying the groundwork, suggesting that the electoral process might be problematic or fraudulent, and he may not accept the results of the election if he were to lose. He did this in 2016, and what have we seen? It came to fruition. He was laying that groundwork. Of course, further, he denied the results of the presidential race in November, claiming widespread voter fraud and election rigging. He launched several legal challenges, all of which were essentially settled or dismissed. But on January 3rd, 2021, we learned from the Washington Post that published a story and an audio tape, love the audio tapes, where Trump pressured the Georgia Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, to recalculate the results and to find him more votes, undermining elections. The second, which for Levitsky and Ziblatt is the third criterion, the third indicator, the toleration or encouragement of violence. Did we not see this from Trump? At his rally, for example, in Fayetteville, North Carolina, where he indeed offered to pay legal fees for someone to toss tomatoes and stuff, right? And more crucially and recently, at the Stop the Steal rally in Washington on January 6th, the big lie was repeated that Trump won by a landslide. It was his election and it was stolen. And what does Trump say in this rally? Quote, "You'll never take back our country with weakness. You have to show strength and you have to be strong." Then you have Giuliani jumping in with all of this, suggesting trial by combat. And Donald Trump Jr. saying, "We're coming for you," regardless of those in Congress, or with respect to, those in Congress who were not with them. 5 people died and dozens of people were injured. Mind viruses are dangerous. David Brooks of the New York Times characterized Trump by saying he smashed through the behavior standards that once governed public life, end quote. Happily, at least I would say, the Trump presidency is over. Democracy prevailed. We have a new president, Joe Biden, and a new presidential administration. Now, the Reconstruction in 2021 can begin. What is the path of Reconstruction? Restoring health. The advancements in medical science and genetics, that's amazing, have allowed for such a rapid decoding of the genetic material of the virus, of the coronavirus, and the new genetic techniques of CRISPR allowed the creation of a messenger RNA vaccine. What a fantastic example of not only human ingenuity, but the joint ventures between science and government. We're on our way to a restoration of health. And now with the Biden administration, who has formed a COVID task force, we might actually have a better and more efficient distribution plan. We've rejoined the World Health Organization, which for unexplainable reasons, Trump pulled out last summer, right in the middle of a pandemic. And scientists will be listened to. So restoration of health, I think, is on the way. But what about restoring truth and diminishing viruses? Lee McIntyre contends that the facts have a way of asserting themselves. And maybe now that we have an administration and we have an American president who will not average 50 false or misleading claims averaging per day, truth might reemerge. But we need the media to take up moral responsibility, and the politicians and the scientists to keep reiterating what is the truth. And true facts, genuine facts, need to be promulgated in media and checks made on social media to depoliticize facts so that truth can be restored in political discourse. As Senator Daniel Moynihan once said, you're entitled to your own opinion, but not to your own facts. So the mind viruses that have facilitated the hyperpolarization, sadly, aren't going to disappear easily. We can't develop the vaccine. But if we can bring civility back in to the political realm, some of those mind viruses, or at least the virulence of the mind viruses, may be reduced a bit. I'd like to point out that we did see one example of civility in this election cycle. In the Utah gubernatorial race, where Republican Lieutenant Governor Spencer Cox and Democrat Chris Peterson, who are political rivals, released a joint ad on October 20th, 2020, where Peterson says, and I'll just give you their little dialogue here. Peterson says, we can debate the issues without degrading each other's character. Cox follows up, we can disagree without hating each other. And Peterson goes on, and win or lose in Utah, we work together. And Cox concludes, so let's show the country that there's a better way. What a refreshing reminder that we can have opponents and disagree fundamentally about policies, but yet remain respectful, diminishing that hyperpolarization and the demonization of the other. President-elect Joe Biden, in his acceptance speech on November 7th, also gave us an effort to reintroduce civility. He said, quote, it's time to put away the harsh rhetoric, to lower the temperature, to see each other again, to listen to each other again, to make progress. We must stop treating our opponents as our enemy. We are not enemies. We are Americans. The harsh rhetoric, together with the lies and disinformation spread on social media sites, needs to be countered with truth, with facts, with science, with messages of civility, in an effort to reduce that homogenized, tribalized thinking that demonizes the other just because they have a different viewpoint. These mind viruses have to be diminished. Their virulence has to be diminished in order to avoid the linguistic and physical violence that we've seen them cause. Again, in the recent cases of anti-Asian racism in this COVID pandemic. We need to lower the temperature, as Joe Biden says. And one way to do this is to move away from the politics of warfare that was characterized by Newt Gingrich when he was in the Speaker of the House, where he introduced the no compromise approach. And that it was in that context that opponents became enemies and on the side of evil. Well, we need to restore civility and mutual toleration. Again, Biden's inaugural speech is an attempt to do this. And I'll just give you a brief excerpt, and I'll be finishing up here very quickly. Biden says this, quote, "Today on this January day, my whole soul is in this, bringing America together, uniting our people, and uniting our nation. I ask every American to join me in this cause. Uniting to fight the common foes we face: anger, resentment, hatred, extremism, lawlessness, violence." And then he goes on to say, we can right wrongs and deliver racial justice. Overcoming this polarization and diminishing the virulence of mind viruses won't be an easy task. And it's not going to be speedy. But at least now we have a plan for Reconstruction. Reconstruction 2021 is going to give us a restoration of health with a COVID vaccine. And the Biden-Harris administration has an extremely long and arduous, hard task to provide and promote unity and civility in our nation. But this administration, I believe strongly, will work to restore truth, which has been what? So crucial to facilitating mind viruses. So I think the Reconstruction 2021, we will restore health, we'll restore truth, and with this new administration and the respect again for the Constitution, democracy too. Let me just end here. I'd like to conclude with the hopeful words of Amanda Gorman. Quote, "When the day comes, we step out of the shade of flame and unafraid. The new dawn blooms as we free it, for there is always light, if only we are brave enough to see it, if only we are brave enough to be it." End quote. Thank you.